I remember seeing a critique of the various forms of personality test, intelligence test, and aptitude test that were circulating and popular in the Western world. I remember a critique pointing out that none of these tests would ever tell you that you're lazy. And laziness is a force as fundamental as gravity or any other law of physics in explaining why society is the way it is around us right now. There can be no doubt that for both those who are very religious and for those who are very secular, the most fundamental reason why the holiday of Christmas continues in its current form is laziness. There are Christians who regard Christmas as wrong because it represents a departure away from what the Bible and legitimate Christianity are supposed to represent. And of course, there are secular atheists who regard Christianity as wrong precisely because it is Christian, and they want to reject or challenge the social status quo of a Christian-dominated, Christian-defined society. But it's hard to do something really creative. It makes you vulnerable. It opens you up to judgment and scorn and mockery. I think everyone is familiar with the paradox of the stereotypical teenager who tries to do something innovative in their style of dress or their style of makeup or hair. A teenager who ostensibly and outwardly says they don't want to conform. They say they want to do something creative, but what they end up doing instead is being different just like everyone else. They conform to some other set of conformist standards, to be redundant, which is to say they reject one set of fashions for another set of fashions that are equally not of their creation, not of their own innovation, and you wonder to what extent it really is elective as opposed to conformist behavior. Something I think all of us have either dealt with ourselves growing up or seen others deal with. I say it with some degree of sympathy. When you do something really creative, even if it is in a theater as shallow as your own hair and makeup and clothing, when you do something genuinely creative, genuinely new, innovative, and unexpected, it opens you up to mockery and scorn. Whereas clothing yourself in the familiar attire of cultural expectations is safe. And the fundamental challenge that atheists, skeptics, and rational thinkers are facing in the 21st century is creative, not destructive. We're past the point when any purpose was served by simply pointing the finger and saying that Christmas is something bad and wrong. Frankly, I think we're past the point of pointing the finger and saying that elements of the faith or the religion themselves are bad and wrong. That only gets you so far. At some point, we have to stand up and creatively face the challenge of not replacing music with silence, but with new, different, better music. Of not replacing customs with a mere empty space and sense of self-righteousness, but of recognizing, when I'm raising my child, I need to have fables to tell. I need to have stories and songs and maybe puppet shows and rituals. And it's not enough for me to merely complain that the rituals of the old society were linked to maybe feudalistic ideals or fascistic ideals or supernatural notions that I want to repudiate. We have to move on from repudiating religion to replacing religion. And I stand in the party of people who don't just want to replace religion with another equivalent religion. I don't just want to see people convert from Islam to Christianity or from Christianity to Buddhism. I really want to see a regeneration of culture in the 21st century from root to branch. And I say this because I think, especially as parents, if we're being honest with ourselves, the vast majority of what is taught to our children is garbage, is a waste of everyone's time. It's a waste of your time singing it as a parent, and it's a waste of the child's time learning it. ring around a rosy, a pocket full of posies. How many times are we going to sing this song? The farmer in the dell. I mean, the whole accumulated wisdom of storybooks and fables and fairy tales. They're intellectually bankrupt and morally bankrupt, ironically, not just from a secular atheist perspective, but also from the perspective of religious fundamentalists. This is often something we have in common at the two extremes, because those are the extremes of people who are questioning cultural conventions and who are asking in a sincere sense, where can we go from here? Now, there's a further irony I want to draw attention to in this video. The irony is this. Nobody likes to be told that they're lazy. Nobody likes to be told that they're self-indulgent and a hypocrite. And yet the role that secular atheist activists have taken on in the 21st century is really one of reproaching the religious establishment for being lazy, intellectually dishonest, self-indulgent, hypocritical, while at the same time showing these same traits, showing how lazy they are, how hypocritical they are, when it comes to the challenge of replacing Christmas or in any way offering a better, positive alternative to the institutions and cultural assumptions that they rightly criticize. To be clear, I'm not saying that they're wrong in criticizing these things. I'm saying that criticism itself has its remit and its limit. And beyond that, we're looking at a truly creative challenge. When I say that people in the new atheist movement are self-indulgent, what do I mean? I was talking to a friend of mine, a relatively old friend of mine, recently, in response to the video just prior to this one on this channel. And she was telling me that she used to go to many of these conferences, normally called secular conferences, new atheist conferences, sometimes using the label of skeptic, humanist, under various headings. And she herself was once sexually assaulted by someone, by a complete stranger at one of these conferences. And she was aware of these controversies circling at the conferences about sexual misconduct and bad behavior of this kind. And she observed, she said, part of the underlying dynamic here is that these are predominantly people who were raised in a repressive religion. They were raised Mormon or Presbyterian or even Catholic or Muslim. And then they come to these conferences to declare that they're ready to sin, that they're ready for all of the indulgences that they denied themselves for so many years when they sincerely believed in this religion, right? And this sets up a kind of intellectual antagonism. It sets up the expectation that the function of the secular movement is to liberate you from the expectations of your grandparents, to set you on a path to this kind of self-indulgence, and to provide a set of ready excuses for things you already desire to do. This isn't a framework that presents you with a challenge of saying, hey, you can't just replace a song with silence. You can't just raise the next generation, raise your own children with a blank sheet of paper where Christmas used to be, or where all these relatively meaningless stories used to be, whether we think of those as corporate children's fables like Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, or if we think of those as the folklore of the Dark Ages or as the legacy of modern Western religion. And the creative element requires great self-discipline, great self-sacrifice, and real vulnerability, where people are going to laugh at you. People are going to make fun of you and scorn you because you're doing something genuinely and authentically nonconformist and creative and new. So I know it's dorky, but I'm out here showing you how it's done. I'm out here so all of you can laugh at me. I've got, this is, you probably saw in the background already, this is a toy representation of Socrates. And I've been going through a stack of books. I already made a book review of one of the worst of them. This is just Aristotle. Been reading The Clouds, which is a classical comedy critique of Socrates in many ways. Different books that have attempted in different ways to popularize and reconceptualize the historical and philosophical importance of Socrates for children, for young adults, and so on. I've been looking around at these materials. I've been looking at them as raw material, as precedents and inspiration, in trying to write my own stories, in trying to challenge, not just the tyranny of, institutional Christianity, but in some ways just the tyranny of mediocrity, the extreme mediocrity of Curious George and Peppa Pig and Batman and Spider-Man, the readily available and meaningless institutions that seem to shape the values that are passed on from one generation to the next. All right? I think people don't realize how easy it is. It's too easy to take up the cause of atheism and skepticism merely as an excuse for cheating on your wife. And I'm sorry, but that is part of what's going on right now in 2018. That is part of the problem. And the torrent of excuses I've received, I don't know, maybe I received as many as 100 messages in total, many dozens of messages, from people who identify as skeptics and new atheists and as members of the movement. I received so many messages insisting to me that there's nothing wrong with celebrating a so-called secular Christmas. I really have to ask you guys to look in the mirror on this one. I really have to ask why it is you're overlooking the points I already made in my first video. It doesn't strike a chord with you. What if you lived in a society where people celebrated the birthday of Adolf Hitler? You may not know it, but you're living in a society like that right now. Every so often, one of those people comes on YouTube and uploads a video of that neo-Nazi subculture celebrating the birthday of Adolf Hitler. All over the world, including within Russia and within China, there are people who still celebrate the birthdays of Joseph Stalin, who celebrate Mao Zedong, who celebrate people who are responsible for mass murder. Those celebrations, those symbolic ritual events, they don't do harm in themselves. They don't hurt people directly. However, they demonstrate who you really are. The reason why it's so terrifying to find out that your neighbor celebrates the birthday of Adolf Hitler is that it tells you something about him and his character. It tells you something about him, of course, morally. If you live in a society or if you live in a family where you're expected to not rock the boat, to just conform, to just get along with the celebration of Adolf Hitler's birthday, at some point there's an onus on you as an adult to say, no, this tradition, this history, it's got to stop somewhere. And it's going to stop with me now standing up and doing what's right because it's the right thing to do, even if I have to risk being laughed at by my own family, definitely, in replacing this with something better. How is it that the new atheist movement has become so lazy that they do not expect of themselves what they expect Muslims to do in much more difficult circumstances? That they do not expect themselves to do what Hindus do in much more difficult circumstances? Would you accept for a minute that someone was an ex-Muslim and rejecting Islam if they participated in all of the outward trappings, rituals, and celebrations of the Muslim faith? You wouldn't accept it at all. You'd demand to know, how is this society ever going to change if people of principle like you don't stand up and make that change happen? And that's what you should demand of yourselves. And you know it would require real courage, real risk to do that in Saudi Arabia, even in Malaysia, Indonesia, the so-called moderate Muslim countries. You can imagine just how hard it would be to stand up and refuse to participate in those cultural conventions. But here in the decadent West, where everything's made easy for you by the corporate culture of so-called secular Christmas, you don't even have what it takes to stand up and do the right thing at no risk to yourself, really at no inconvenience. And maybe that is because you have come to regard secularism as something self-indulgent. As something destructive, yes, in that you just see the critique of religion, the repudiation of religion as the whole of your movement, but also in that you're avoiding really thinking through the possibility that there's an onus on you to take the next step, to do something creative, if not for yourself alone, for the next generation, and for the changes that's going to bring about in society. These things do have negative consequences for people. Living a life of prayer, of self-deception, living a life defined by cultural expectations that are even indirectly formed by these religions. Living a life in which you perceive the political status quo, hierarchy, authority, secular authority even, in religious terms, in which the whole scope of what's thinkable and unthinkable to you is formed by the legacy of religion going back for so many centuries, the accretions of religion. Even when you take faith out of the picture, because the vast majority of people living within a Muslim society, a Jewish society, a Christian society, I have no doubt the majority of these people truly in their heart of hearts don't believe or feel that they can't believe even if they want to believe. But they nevertheless live within those strictures. They live lives in which they are constantly, in subtle ways, encouraging others, discouraging others, and punishing others to live within the narrow band of what is thinkable in a religious worldview. And it's that worldview we're trying to take apart and to replace with something better. As I say, I've received maybe 100 excuses for why so-called secular activists, new atheists, etc., think there's nothing wrong with continuing to celebrate Christmas. I think every single one of you is a hypocrite who could not for even 1 year take on the burden of in this same way celebrating Muslim religious traditions in an atheist way, who could not for 1 year take on the celebration of Hindu cultural traditions in an atheist way. And you wouldn't, looking across the border to those countries, you wouldn't look fondly or kindly on someone who was themselves personally and inwardly an atheist, but raising their own child in that way within the strictures of a Muslim cultural tradition, of a Hindu cultural tradition. Because everything you believe, everything you represent, is a challenge to and a negation of that tradition. So all I've got to say to you is, I hope you find the strength to be vulnerable, to be creative, and to see that we collectively can do better than the Bible. We can offer something better than Christmas. And I think also we can offer something better than Batman and Curious George. But it's all got to begin with the recognition that there is a problem, that there's a creative challenge for us to face. So stop making excuses for so-called secular Christmas. It's lazy, it's hypocritical, it's self-indulgent, and it's morally wrong.